Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Light Camera Author. I'm your host, Jim Juno. The Nuremberg trials remain one of the defining moments of the 20th century. After World War II, the world's leading Nazi officials faced justice for crimes that shocked humanity. But just hours before he was scheduled to be executed, Hermann Goering, the highest-ranking Nazi defendant, committed suicide with a cyanide capsule. And that single act sparked one of history's greatest mysteries. How did one of the most heavily guarded prisoners in the world obtain poison while under constant Allied surveillance? For nearly 8 decades, historians debated the answer, and my guest today believes he solved that mystery. Paul Hooley is the author of a new book entitled Goring Suicide: They Will Not Hang Me, a meticulously researched investigation that draws upon newly uncovered testimony and historical records to reconstruct Goering's final days and explain what really happened. Paul, welcome to Life Camera Author.
Thank you, Jim, and how kind of you to ask me on. Hope you are well and your listeners.
Well, thank you so much. Now, every historian has one story that they simply can't let go. And what was it about Hermann Goering, his death, that convinced you that there was still unanswered questions after nearly 80 years?
Well, the essence of this book is that it provides the definitive answer with convincing supportive evidence, I'm pleased to say, to one of the 20th century's most enduring and frustrating mysteries, as you said. How and why Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, second only to Hitler in the hierarchy of the Nazis, was given the cyanide capsule that enabled him to commit suicide at the most dramatic point of history's greatest trial. This year marks the 80th anniversary of several important events, including the suicide, the end of the Third Reich, the conclusion of the year-long International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg that tried 24 major Nazis deemed to have been responsible for planning or being involved in the Holocaust and other war crimes, and the execution of 10 of those war criminals. Symbolically, the trial's Chief Justice, Robert Jackson, sought to hold one man responsible for the crimes of individuals, collectives, regimes, and a nation, and to see that man die as a common criminal with a rope around his neck. With Hitler dead, only one defendant fitted that profile, and that was Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, founder of the Gestapo, creator of concentration camps, and originator of the term the final solution, a euphemism for the extermination of Jews. Found guilty on all charges, Goering was sentenced to death by the rope and designated to be the first of the war criminals to be hanged. He accepted his fate but made several requests to be allowed to face a firing squad, all of which were refused. As a proud hero of World War I, holder of the Blue Max, Iron Cross, and a dozen other awards for gallantry, to be hanged was the greatest possible humiliation and dishonour for Goering and for Germany, and he was never going to allow that happen. And having proclaimed, "They will not hang me," he bit into the cyanide capsule just 2 hours before he was scheduled to leave his Confederates to the gallows. And in so doing, he wrecked the Allies' plans for a showpiece hanging. And to his legions of supporters, he exited this world a martyr and a hero who had lifted the spirits of a defeated nation in its darkest hours, the very departure the Allies were desperate to avoid.
You know, a lot of people would assume that history is settled once enough time has passed. But what convinced you that historians had overlooked important evidence?
Well, if I could tell you, Jim, a little about this journey. Since the launch of my two previous books on the life and times of British Army Captain Wolfe Frank, who was the chief interpreter at Nuremberg and the leading pioneer of simultaneous interpretation, which was born at Nuremberg, I've given a series of lectures, interviews, and broadcasts and carried out a number of book signing assignments. These brought me into contact with people who had known Frank, and they furnished me with further anecdotes about the man many believe should be counted amongst the most interesting, courageous, romantic, and charismatic figures of the 20th century. One such occasion, I met a person of great integrity who had known Frank very well in his later years, and they divulged information that ultimately proved to be the catalyst for the book. That person recounted conversations Frank had with a group of close friends in their presence shortly before he took his own life in 1988, during which he revealed he had been present when the cyanide had been passed to Goering. I was intrigued by the possibility, and the revelation from a person of impeccable standing needed to be taken seriously. I stored the information away and thought little about it until I came across another interview, which was given a few months before his death by US Navy Lieutenant Edwin Putzel, in which he openly admitted that prior to the start of the IMT in November 1945, he had passed the cyanide to Goering at the behest of his commanding officer, General William Wild Bill Donovan, in the presence of a witness and with the agreement of the British contingent at Nuremberg. Immediately an alert started ringing. Was it possible, I wondered, that the admission of these two men with no apparent connections in two different countries at two different times were referring to the same incident? Could they have known each other? Could they have worked together? Were they interrogating Goering during the same period? And was it possible that Frank was the witness to whom Putzel was referring? My further researches led me to conclude that the answer to all those questions was an emphatic yes. It was more possible. And so, figuratively speaking, began my journey of 1,000 miles with a single step.
That was 1988?
1988 when he took his life, but he gave his archive to another person I know who stored them in his loft for 25 years. So it wasn't until 2018 that I began to research all these things. But it was another friend of Frank's, who set me on the trail by the revelation that he had said he had been present when the cyanide capsule was passed to Goering. Now, sorry, carry on.
The Nuremberg prison was considered the most secure detention facility in history. Can you describe the security surrounding Goering during those final days?
I can, yes. He was, as you say, under constant 24-hour watch, with guards posted at the door of his cell day and night. And he was taken to and from all his interviews by guards, and there was no chance that he could have been past the suicide, so they believe, by anyone who was connected with the prison. And that was the conclusion of the investigation. But 6 men came together for a very brief period at Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945, a year before he took the capsule, and they effected what you might describe as being an act of monumental subterfuge and audacity executed by masters of deception. And even historical seasoned investigators could not unpick this until the last survivor of the group explained what had really happened shortly before his death, almost 60 years after the event. And those disclosures are as astounding as they are unequivocal. Yet astonishingly, until this book, they've never been scrutinised, and as with the men who made them, they have never been afforded the levels of investigation, respect, or credibility they deserve. Now, 4 of that group took the secrets to their graves. And as I say, the definitive solution was only revealed by my studying in detail the omissions of the remaining 2, separately and in parallel, alongside all the existing accepted evidence, new information, and the involvements and backstories of those 6 men.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, without revealing every surprise that's in the book, because we want people to buy the book, what are some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Goering's suicide?
Well, US President Harry Truman, anticipating the end of the war, had appointed Robert Jackson to be US Chief Counsel for the prosecution, and he gave him complete freedom to choose his own staff and implement the trial. Now, arguably, the US's greatest ever war hero, General William Donovan, was appointed Special Assistant to Jackson. He was a leading lawyer, diplomat, and intelligence supremo, as you all know, and he became the first and only head of the Office of Strategic Services, the US's World War II secret intelligence agency that evolved into the CIA. Donovan is the only person to have received all four of the US's highest awards: the Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Service Medal, and the National Security Medal. And he was also awarded the Silver Star, Purple Heart, and countless other decorations from other nations, including an honorary knighthood of the British Empire. He was so senior in military matters, he was answerable only to the President of the USA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And by the end of the war, he commanded 13,000 personnel or agents. If I can just elaborate a little, it's essential that the statements Edwin Purcell gave to highly regarded author and journalist Petronella Wyatt, that was published in The Spectator, the world's oldest weekly news magazine, in 2023, of which she was deputy editor, and Purcell was in his 90th year at the time. They must be considered alongside the man's background, character, lifetime achievements, and his importance as an aide to General Donovan. He joined Donovan's Wall Street legal practice straight from university in the 1930s, and he began a life that led him to becoming both a leading lawyer and a top spy master. His office was situated next to Donovan's in the law practice, and he lived with the general and his family for a while. When President Roosevelt picked Donovan to head up the OSS, Donovan picked Purcell to be his right-hand man, and he pulled strings to get his protege into the US Navy so he could remain at his side throughout the war and at Nuremberg. Donovan appointed Purcell to be the executive officer, his second in command of the OSS, and he became the general's gatekeeper and travelling companion, attending to the minutest details of his trips. He watched Donovan's back, handled the dirty administrative chores of enforcing his orders and easing out poor performers. And throughout his long and distinguished life, Purcell promoted and adhered to the highest civic, moral, and ethical standards on the world stage, nationally, locally, and in his private life. Every position he held was one of trust, and as a leading lawyer of 65 years standing, making representations at every level within the US justice system, up to and including Congress and the Supreme Court, it's also safe to say he had a natural, professional, and ethical commitment to tell the truth. It's inconceivable, therefore, that a man who had lived such a trustworthy and exemplary life would shortly before his death invent the statements he gave to Miss Wyatt, or in any way attach any kind of falsehood to the name of the man he most admired, his dear and close friend, colleague, superior officer, lifelong hero and mentor, General Donovan. In short, their bond was so great it lasted for the rest of the general's life, and about which Purcell recorded, "It was a sort of father-son relationship, which I will always treasure."
Now, your book reads almost like a detective novel. Did you approach this as a historian or as an investigator, assembling evidence piece by piece?
Funny you should ask that, Jim. I consider myself to be a history detective. Now, people such as myself are authors who look at evidence from the past, well knowing that the further back in time we delve, the harder it is to find the clues. But we don't want to catch criminals or bring anyone to justice. But they do seek to solve any mysteries surrounding historical incidents, especially those of significance that have consistently baffled and frustrated historians and other investigators. We also seek to provide compelling evidence and convincing explanations in support of our findings and reveal the identities of the personalities involved, clear up any subsidiary puzzles such as backstories and motives. And this is all achieved in this book, I'm pleased to say.
Now, the Nuremberg trials, they weren't simply criminal proceedings. They helped establish modern international law. So how significant would Goring's public execution have been to the Allies?
Uh, it was paramount. And the fact that he managed to take the poison. Could I just read you a little bit that I've got here, which Time magazine wrote to, I think, so clearly put before anyone who reads these things the significance of what happened. Um, it's called No German Tears, but it says bowed Nuremberg suddenly straightened up. Men with glistening eyes stopped for excited talks with one another. Little knots gather. Germans who had avoided the eyes of Americans the night before now looked at them frankly with derisive smiles. The general reaction was, he put one over on you. The rich old Goering legend was back. He was courageous. After all, he had been a fighter ace. He was clever. Did he not dominate the trials? He had obeyed every rule, had been watched day and night, had boasted he wouldn't hang, and he didn't. The old Teutonic drums were beating strong in the sunlight. There were no German tears, no German regrets or shame. On the contrary, the Germans now had the feeling of triumph, which they had lacked for so long. Goering's one sharp, breathtaking act wiped away 10 months of painstaking work.
That's incredible, yes. And, did your understanding of Goering change during your research?
Um, to a certain extent, it did. Um, he was a very brave man as well as Airy Neve, one of those involved in this, was to state that he was a cruel man, but he had such bravery as well. And he stood up to everything that they threw at him in the trial. And there was a time where it looked as though he might actually convince everybody that he wasn't the uh, evil man that we all know him to be. And Airy Neve actually said, he was putting forward a logical answer to everything that the Allies had put for him. But it was, in the end, it was to no avail. And he knew that. He knew that what his fate was to be. All that mattered to him was the way he died, not as a common criminal, but to the German people, as the war hero that he constantly believed he was.
Now, there were more people involved besides Goering. Now, because it had to be people who helped him in this endeavor. Now, the guards, or I guess I'm going to ask you, what surprised you most about the other personalities, the guards, the interrogators, prosecutors?
Uh, well, the fact that General Donovan um, was assistant of Robert Jackson, and I should also tell you that the president of the US had decided that he would disband the OSS at the end of the war. So Donovan was so keen to show the worth of that agency and that a replacement should be started up as soon as possible afterwards. And he saw himself as being the head of that agency, which eventually did become the CIA, of course, of which he's considered to be the founding father and the guiding light. But the president had given Robert Jackson complete authority to choose his own staff and to implement the trial. So Donovan, although he told Jackson he knew who the team captain was and he would play wherever, uh, he really didn't mean that. He intended to play the star role on the prosecution at the trial and establish that need for the second agency once the war was over. Inevitably, these two clashed and over the direction of the prosecution, and their teams started to take side. Jackson began to shrink Donovan's role, which infuriated the general, who had brought 172 of his OSS officers onto the prosecution team, and he began to organise his own independent course of action. He had 10 private meetings with Goering, and he convinced him that they were two like-minded conspirators. He told Goering there was no way he could escape death, but he could die like a man after a full confession. The egotistical Goering, who knew the only question was how he met his end, was intrigued with the idea of, as his biographer says, copping a plea and ratting on his comrades if the price was right. Donovan was after what would be the world's most sensational plea bargain. Goering would accept full responsibility for the war crimes, which would dramatically shorten the trial, and he would take the stand to sell out the others. In return, he would be executed as a soldier before a firing squad, instead of suffering the humiliation of hanging. This was all Goering had asked for, and he began to cooperate. And it was during this series of meetings, as Putzel revealed, that Donovan secretly decided, with the agreement of the British contingent, to let Goering die by cyanide if the authorities refused to allow him to die like a man, as Donovan had promised. Goering stated to the end that Donovan was the only prosecutor he could trust, yet to be able to go along with Goering's plan, with the general's plan, he would have insisted upon a guaranteed alternative method of dying in the event the prosecution did not honour the unwritten agreement they'd made, or if for any reason Donovan was no longer around. And this is exactly what happened.
Are there any other World War II mysteries that you would like to see uncovered?
It's taken me 2 or 3 years to put this one together. I have to tell you, I'm now in my mid-80s, Joe, but I was very aware I was the only person in the world who knew the answer to one of the 20th century's great unsolved mysteries, and it was a heavy burden to carry around. That was one of the things that drove me to get the book out, and it's a huge relief to know that that has been achieved and that I provided the important record for posterity. The book is a tribute and further acknowledgement of the history-defining roles played during the Second World War and at Nuremberg by General Donovan, Edwin Putzel, Major Airey Neve, and Captain Wolfrank, four of freedom's greatest champions who came together by chance for a few weeks in the autumn of 1945. The overriding mission of all four, on behalf of humanity, was to see that criminals in general, and Goering in particular, answer for all the atrocities carried out by the Nazis during their reign of terror. And those officers, 3 of them attorneys and prosecutors, also had personal reasons for enduring justice, and guilt and punishments were rightly and fairly attributed. In Donovan and Putzel's case, it was on behalf of their OSS colleagues who had been tortured and murdered. For Neve, it was for the Allied air crews and resistant line agents and helpers who had met with similar fates, for whom he felt responsible. And for Frank, it was for the family and friends and all who had disappeared into the fog and night, or who had suffered in connection with or in concentration camps. Much has
Well,
been written over the years about General Donovan and Airey Neave, but until my books have been published, nothing was really known about Wolf Frank and Edward Putzel, and I'm therefore so pleased their stories and their contributions will be more widely known. It's been an honour and a privilege for me to have researched and written this record of the journeys and lives of these four such unique, dedicated, charismatic seekers of justice, the likes of which I don't think we will ever see again.
well, this has been fascinating to talk with you, Paul. Your book reminds us that history continues to evolve even as new evidence emerges and careful researchers challenge long held assumptions. The author's name is Paul Hooley, and the book is Goering Suicide. They Will Not Hang Me. And it's out, I believe it's out now
It
on
is
Amazon
Amazon or all good bookstores, casemate
books.
in the USA as well.
Yes, indeed. So, Paul, I really want to thank you for being on Light Camera Author tonight.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me and wish you all a very happy remainder of the summer.
Thank you so much. And all of you, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe, leave a review. And until next time, I'm Jim Juno, reminding you that every great book has an author behind the story to tell. Thanks for listening to Lights Camera Author.